Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. This time we're looking at one of the most audacious moments of World War II, the Doolittle Raid. Now, most of you listening probably know the basics. It's early 1942, just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. America really needs a win at this point.
Yeah, morale's low. The idea of striking back at Japan seems, well, next to impossible.
Yeah, until now. So this is where a real American legend comes into the picture. Jimmy Doolittle.
A pilot, engineer, really known for pushing boundaries, and I think this is a perfect example of that.
Oh, absolutely. And get this, he's going to launch land-based bombers.
Yeah.
B-25 to be exact, from an aircraft carrier. I mean, has that ever been done before?
Never. The technical challenges here are just unbelievable.
Right.
B-25s need a runway of almost half a mile to take off, and landing back on the carrier is out of the question.
Yeah, there's no way.
So Doolittle and his team had to come up with some pretty creative solutions, turning these bombers into lean, mean, long-range flying machines. Yeah, they pretty much stripped these B-25s down to bare bones. One source even described it as turning them into flying gas cans. So, I mean, who in their right mind would sign up for this kind of mission?
Well, when Doolittle called for volunteers, he just said it was a dangerous mission. Didn't give any details, really. But over 120 airmen stepped forward, ready to face the unknown.
Yeah, these guys are the definition of bravery.
Absolutely. And they trained relentlessly for this, practicing takeoffs on runways that were marked to the exact length of a carrier deck.
I can't even imagine the pressure those pilots were under during training, knowing what they were preparing for.
No kidding. But that level of dedication, that willingness to push past those perceived limits, I think that's essential to understanding how this raid succeeded against all odds.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the spirit of the time. Now let's step back for a second and look at just the sheer scale of this whole operation.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking 16 modified B-25s, a crew of over 200, an entire naval task force, including the carriers USS Hornet and Enterprise.
A massive undertaking, and all cloaked in secrecy. They even left San Francisco in broad daylight on April Fool's Day, 1942.
Wow, talk about irony.
I know, almost like they were playing a prank on the Japanese.
Yeah, but I think the gravity of their mission wouldn't really sink in until they were out at sea, when they finally learned their target.
Tokyo.
Right.
You can only imagine that mix of emotions for those crews. Excitement, fear, the weight of responsibility, knowing that they were heading into the heart of enemy territory.
And the journey across the Pacific, I mean, that had to be tense, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they received their target assignments maps for landing in China. They were even given some basic Chinese and Japanese phrases.
Trying to cram in language basics while sailing towards a top-secret bombing mission. It's kind of surreal when you think about it.
Yeah, it really humanizes this whole grand military operation.
For sure.
These were just soldiers. They were individuals facing immense danger far from home. And to add to the intensity, they had to fly at an incredibly low altitude, just 500 feet above Japan.
Right.
Not only for accuracy, but also to avoid Japanese air defenses that were designed for high-altitude attacks.
Yeah, flying under the radar, literally.
Right.
But here's where things get really interesting. They encounter a Japanese picket boat, and it forces them to launch 12 hours early, adding 500 to 600 miles to an already dangerous flight plan.
Oh, man. Talk about pressure.
Suddenly, it's not just a daring mission. It's a race against time and dwindling fuel.
Then we get to Doolittle's own takeoff. Stormy weather, rough seas. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine a more challenging situation for getting a bomber airborne.
The carrier's pitching up and down, the views alternating between sky and ocean. Doolittle had less than 500 feet of runway to get airborne.
Gosh.
It's a scene straight out of a movie. And to make matters worse, a crewman lost an arm in a propeller accident. Just a stark reminder of the danger they were facing, even before reaching their target.
It's hard to believe that despite all of this, all 16 bombers successfully launched, defying the odds. Embarking on this incredible mission, these land-based bombers, taking off from an aircraft carrier, heading toward the seemingly invincible Japan. It's just amazing. All right, so we're back, and we left off with those 16 B-25s, launched from an aircraft carrier, in broad daylight, heading toward Japan. I mean, can you even believe how audacious this mission was?
A total gamble. And as they flew toward their targets, they were actually divided into groups, each assigned to a specific city.
Okay, so what cities are we talking about?
Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. And remember, they were flying extremely low, about 500 feet, to avoid Japanese radar.
So they're basically skimming rooftops at this point. I mean, what was it like for the crews during those bombing runs?
Well, there are accounts of children in baseball fields just waving up at them,
Yeah.
totally oblivious to the danger.
Wow.
So it's just this stark contrast. You've got everyday life juxtaposed with this incredibly daring military operation.
I mean, the element of surprise must have been huge here.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did the Japanese respond?
It was pretty chaotic, to be honest. You'd think they'd be ready for something even at low altitude. But a lot of their experienced military personnel were deployed elsewhere, across the Pacific, in those offensive campaigns. And the ones left behind to defend the homeland, well, they weren't exactly the best.
So a little bit of luck on the Doolittle Raider side.
You could say that. There were even reports of Japanese anti-aircraft gunners causing more damage to Tokyo than the bombers themselves, just firing wildly at those low-flying planes.
Wow. That's wild. So it sounds like they were really unprepared for this kind of attack.
Completely.
All right, so let's get to the impact of the raid. How much damage did they actually do?
In terms of physical destruction, it wasn't that extensive. A few buildings, some industrial facilities, but nothing truly crippling.
So if it wasn't about large-scale destruction, then what was the real point?
It was about psychology, a blow to Japan's pride, and a much-needed morale boost for America. Remember, they were still reeling from Pearl Harbor just months earlier.
Right. It felt like Japan was unstoppable at that point. So the raid was more of a message, like, hey, we can hit you even on your home turf.
Precisely. And it worked. The raid shocked Japan, shattered their sense of invincibility, and it forced them to divert resources back home for defense, which then weakened their offensive capabilities in the Pacific.
It's amazing how this one seemingly small action could have such significant strategic consequences.
It really is.
But we can't forget that those bombers couldn't just turn around and fly back. They had a long and dangerous journey ahead of them to get to safety.
That's right. The plan was to fly to China and land at airfields set up by the Chinese resistance. But with that early launch, they added hundreds of miles to their flight path, pushing them to the very limit of their fuel capacity.
Talk about a high-pressure situation.
No kidding.
So how did they even manage to escape?
It was a mix of skill luck and just pure determination. 15 of the 16 planes reached the Chinese coast, but most had to crash land, scattered across a wide area.
And one crewman was lost during a bailout, and 2 crews went missing entirely. Right. And of course, Doolittle himself had to parachute into China, even injuring his ankle in the process. That must have been chaos.
It was. But even in the midst of all that chaos, there are these amazing stories of survival and connection. Doolittle received help from Chinese soldiers. And he even encountered John Birch, the missionary whose name would later become associated with a very different kind of political movement.
Wow, history really does have a way of weaving together these seemingly unrelated threads.
Doesn't it?
It really does. But like you said earlier, the impact of the Doolittle Raid goes way beyond those crash landings in China.
Absolutely.
There's a whole other chapter to this story that we haven't even touched on yet.
The legal chapter.
Right.
And it's a chapter that reveals a lot about the complex relationship between wartime actions and the pursuit of justice. Of the 8 crewmen captured by the Japanese, 3 were executed, and the remaining 5 were subjected to brutal torture.
Torture?
Yes.
Why would the Japanese do that?
Well, of course they wanted information. They wanted to understand how the Americans pulled off such an audacious raid. But there was also a deeper, more emotional motive at play.
What was that?
Revenge. They were humiliated.
So it wasn't just about intelligence gathering, it was about retaliation.
Exactly. And their methods were barbaric. Waterboarding, sleep deprivation, mock executions.
That's horrible.
It was a dark chapter.
But the Japanese didn't stop there, right?
No.
They actually wanted a legal justification for their actions.
They did.
I mean, a legal justification for torture and execution, that seems like a stretch even in wartime.
It does, doesn't it? But they were obsessed with maintaining this facade of legality, even while committing these atrocities. They forced the captured airmen to confess to war crimes, claiming that they intentionally targeted civilians.
False confessions coerced under duress. It's a tactic that's been used by authoritarian regimes throughout history.
Sadly, it's true. And it still happens today.
So the Japanese legal maneuvering didn't end there.
No, it didn't.
They even staged a show trial.
They did.
A kangaroo court in the middle of a war.
It was a blatant attempt to manipulate the law to serve their own ends.
And it had terrible consequences for those airmen.
It did.
But this perversion of justice would ultimately backfire on the Japanese.
It would.
And it would lead to a surprising and significant legal legacy.
Yes.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The audacity of the raid itself, the strategic impact, the harrowing escape, even the brutal treatment of those captured airmen. But you mentioned a legal legacy emerging from all of this, and honestly, it's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of torture and show trials.
It's really remarkable, though, kind of a testament to the enduring power of the rule of law, even in the face of such darkness, the Doolittle Raid, and specifically how the Japanese treated those captured airmen. It really became a rallying cry for justice in the U.S.
So it shifted from a focus on revenge to one of accountability.
Exactly. There was this growing determination that war criminals should be held accountable, not through like summary executions or anything, but through actual legal processes.
And that led to the establishment of international tribunals, like the Nuremberg trials in Germany.
Oh, right.
The ones we typically hear about.
Yeah, but there were similar trials for Japanese war criminals, too.
Oh, right, the
Yeah.
Tokyo trials.
Exactly.
Not as well known, but just as significant.
And this is where the Doolittle Raid trial comes in. It focused specifically on those Japanese judges and prosecutors who were behind that sham trial back in 1942.
So they put the legal system itself on trial?
Yeah.
What were they hoping to achieve with that?
It was an unprecedented move. They were holding individuals accountable, not just for acts of violence, but for actually perverting the law to support those acts.
Wow.
This trial set a really crucial precedent, recognizing the importance of fair trials, even during war.
So the Doolittle Raid, a story of incredible daring and sacrifice, also played a role in shaping international legal standards.
It did.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a remarkable legacy. The Doolittle Raid trial directly led to the inclusion of a vital clause in the Geneva Conventions, Article 3. This article mandates fair trials and judicial guarantees recognized as indispensable by civilized people, even in the context of armed conflict.
So even amidst the horrors of war, there was this push for a higher standard of justice, a recognition that some fundamental rights just cannot be ignored.
Absolutely.
And that legacy continues to this day. I mean, think about the International Criminal Court and the pursuit of justice for war crimes in conflicts all around the world. Those efforts are rooted, in part, in the legal precedents set after World War II.
For sure.
It's amazing to think that this single event, the Doolittle Raid, had such a profound and far-reaching impact. It really makes you realize that even seemingly small actions can have this ripple effect, shaping the course of history in ways we might never expect.
I think that's a great point. The Doolittle Raid is often celebrated for its boldness and the heroism of everyone involved. But maybe its greatest legacy is this enduring principle that even in the darkest times of war, the rule of law must prevail.
It's a powerful message for sure, and one worth remembering. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Doolittle Raid. For our listeners who want to go even deeper into the story, I highly recommend Michelle Peri's book, Last Mission to Tokyo. It's a great read. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for this pivotal moment in history, not just for its military significance, but for its lasting impact on the pursuit of justice around the world. Join us next time as we explore another fascinating corner of history, uncovering the hidden connections and surprising legacies that continue to shape our world today.